Oh, nothing but just what I used to read in the paper. I just knew that there was a war going on, and I could tell by the circumstances, by I think they had U-boats had sunk some of our ships, and therefore I knew that sooner or later we were going to get into it with Germany. But at the same time, I was really kind of surprised when Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor, and I think everybody else was too, because we were very unprepared for that. I really don't remember where I was, to be honest with you. All I remember is that it happened. And I can't recall where I was or what time of the day I heard it. Well, I joined the Navy in 1944 in October, because my birthday was November the 7th, and I didn't want to be drafted. And my dad was the next Navy man, so he agreed to sign my papers the last week in October before my birthday so I could join the Navy. So that's what I did. I joined the Navy then. And I went to Little Rock, Arkansas, where I was given my physical and inducted, and then went on a troop train to San Diego, where I had boot camp. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they had cut boot camp from 12 weeks to 8 weeks at that time. So I went to 8 weeks of boot camp. And in the meantime, and when I was in boot camp, well, I met a friend from Hot Springs, Carl Heineman, who was assistant postmaster at Hot Springs, and knew me and knew I was out there, and so he looked me up. And he asked me, he says, well, what are you going to do when you finish basic? And I said, well, I guess I'll go to sea as a seaman. So I don't know what he did, but he pulled some strings and got me into the Fleet Post Office. So then I went to San Francisco for 6 weeks, I believe it was. Lived out as a citizen and went to a postal school at San Francisco, which was the Fleet Post Office School for the Navy. And what we were doing was repairing. We didn't know it at the time, but I went to Hawaii and took 6 weeks of, 4 weeks of amphibious training. And I said, man, what is a postal man doing taking amphibious training? Well, then it finally dawned on all of us, we were getting ready for the invasion of Japan. So after that, then we loaded us on to LSTs, and which are landing ship craft, as you know, and we went to Saipan, where we had a big rendezvous. And with other ships, and we got in a big fleet, and then we were headed to Japan for the invasion of Japan when they dropped the atomic bomb, and we were, I don't know how many miles out from Japan when the war ended. But we went ahead then into Japan at Wakayama, Japan, because we couldn't get into Kobe because the harbor was mined. So we went into Wakayama, and the Army was the invasion, and we set out into the bay. But then we finally went in and set up a post office in some little old store. Well, the only thing I can really remember is when we first went into Wakayama, the Japanese people would stand in their house and just look out through the door. They were very shy and didn't know what to expect, I guess, from us Americans. And like I said, the Army had already kind of gone through and were inland more, and we were right there on the coast. But it would take them, I would say, approximately 6 months before they really got any friendly with us. At first, they were just, like I said, they were just like scared dogs. And they would just stay away from us, wouldn't mix with us. But then they got the intermingling, coming out into the street and so forth, and sayonara and ho-hi-ho, and that's about it. Well, always said the ships would come in and they would bring us their mail to be mailed, and we sold money orders, and you'd surprise some of the sailors would buy money orders, and we sold money orders, and then just sent the mail, and usually we sent the mail to San Francisco Fleet Post Office where it was dispatched into the States. But it was just very slow because there wasn't really that much activity. Well, we came home on a troop ship and it was very crowded and hot and a little bit rough at times on the sea. And we came into San Francisco, and I can't remember, it seemed like it took us forever on that troop ship. And then I went from San Francisco and I went to St. Louis, Missouri, where I was dispatched out of St. Louis. Well, I was glad to come home after being over there for a year and a half. I was only in about 2 years. So I was glad that it was all over, and I didn't have any problems, and I didn't run into any problems in Japan with the people, and I was happy to get home.
When I went to work with a telephone company, I went to Pine Bluff, and they had an Army Air Corps training field at Pine Bluff, cadet training field, and I decided I didn't want to be in the Army. I wanted in the Marine Corps, but nobody could tell me how to get in it as a pilot. So I finally found an old Army chief petty officer in recruiting that said I could go into naval training and then request a commission in the Marine Corps. Well, didn't know whether I could believe him or not, but anyway, that's what I decided to do. Then when I went to, I took all the tests at Pine Bluff and then at Little Rock, and they were going to send me to New Orleans that night. And I said, well, it doesn't work quite that way, because I have a job that I have to make arrangements to not do, and I was living in a rooming house at that time, paying $7, started out paying $7 a week room and board. But anyway, I wound up going to New Orleans the next day. Well, after 2 years of college, I needed to go to work to get some more money. And I was in Pine Bluff working. This was on Sunday morning. And I got a phone call from who is now my wife telling me what had happened that Sunday morning. So they were drafting at that time, but there wasn't a real big push. But then from then on, there was lines at the recruiting offices, people trying to get in. Well, on my instructor was off a weekend, and he had put me up for a flight check. And I didn't have the 10 hours, and I was supposed to have 12. So I told the check pilot, I said, I didn't even have the hours for a thing. And besides that, my instructor didn't let me fly that airplane very much. So I really didn't think I was quite ready to solo. But anyway, the guy says, well, let's go on out, and said, I'll come back and check. So when he got out and started to take off, he said, lock the tail wheel. I said, where is the lock? I didn't even know. Instructor had never told me anything about tail wheel. I always thought it was there and it stayed that way. But anyway, I got through that flight. All of a sudden I had a up check and another flight with another check pilot. You had to have two ups. He gave me an instructor's up, and this other guy was a check pilot. So I went out on that flight. And the other thing about it, I'd never taxied an airplane.
Never taxied.
Even with that instructor. They didn't want to get out there and get in the air. So the instructor told me to taxi it out, so I got it out there. Took off, came back, went through all the maneuvers that he wanted, came back. In a few minutes, there was another up check and a schedule for a solo. So I said, okay. Well, I got out and flew around for about an hour, came back to land, and the wind was not down the runway. It was off about 45 degrees and blowing pretty good, maybe 60, 70 degrees. But I went in to land, and the guy in front of me ground looped. So I had to give it the gun and come around again. Next guy in front of me ground looped.
Well, what is ground loop?
Well, you come in and with the way the wind is, the airplane tends to go into the wind. So what it does, that wind, when they had hit, that wind would want to turn you that way, and they couldn't stop, so you just started spinning. Anyway, 3 of them did that in front of me. So I figured, well, here goes. But I did get it on the ground, didn't get a wingtip, and didn't ground loop. So that was my first experience with flying. One thing, we were lucky. Most people, I guess, don't even realize it. You know, Roosevelt had this CCC program, and those people trained just like soldiers. You know, they took shovels and marched out in the forest to build dams and bridges and revetments and this, that, and the other thing. So there was a pretty good backlog of nearly trained soldiers in that they were taught a little bit of discipline and a little bit of regimentation. So the United States had a little bit of a running start on that because there'd been, in the world, there had been wars going on for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I got overseas just before the truce was signed, and I was out on Guam. And then from there, I went on into Japan, and I went in and saw. See, we were making plans for the invasion of Japan.
Oh yeah.
And then when I went into Japan, I looked at some of these areas where we were supposed to go in. It would have been a massacre in a lot of cases. So they can say, okay, the Japanese lost 150,000 with the dropping of the bomb. That's peanuts as to what we could have lost trying to invade Japan. And those people, you know, they're emperor worshipers. And they they do what the emperor says. And if he says fight to the death, that's what they do. When the emperor said you're a conquering nation, you'll do as the Americans say, that was it. I mean, they just turned over.
In 1941, a brother 2.5 years older than I were in Crane, Missouri, Stone County, operating a shoe store. I was a sophomore in high school. He had just finished high school. And we would go to a community a few miles from Crane to go roller skating. And we'd hitchhike down there and hitchhike back to Crane. On the hitchhiking back to Crane, the couple who picked me up asked me if I'd heard the radio news, and I said, no, what's the news? And they said, Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Dad and Mother wanted me to come back home at the end of that sophomore school semester because my older brother Bob was old enough to be draftable, and they knew he might be called out of the store at any time. In fact, when I started at the store with him, he wrote me a letter of 6 or 8 pages, as though I would have to go up there and find him already called into the military. And he told me where to find the key to the store. I had worked in a similar store in Huntsville. And he told me who the important people were in the community, who the landlady was that we should pay the rent to, what I should do about ordering new supplies and equipment, and how I should handle the store while he might be in the military. The fact was, it was probably March or April before he went into military service, and I had returned home in December at that time. So I was active in the high school at Huntsville, very much of a patriotic fever among the students. There was a scrap metal drive nationally in which President Roosevelt was urging everyone to deposit all the scrap metal they could salvage and turn it in for changing it from metal to bullets. And Madison County in northwest Arkansas had more tonnage per school child than any other county in the nation. There were reasons for that. There were several canning factories. Not cannon factories, we didn't make cannons up there. Made some stills, but no cannons. Anyway, these boilers in the canning factories were tremendously heavy. Had to have heavy equipment even to lift them. In fact, most of them with soldering torches were broken into pieces and then shipped off to the scrap metal drive. There were also patriotic activities such as auction sales in the high school among the students, and the person who auctioned so much money was spending that money for savings stamps, they call them. So many savings stamps could accumulate to be worth a savings bond. And in that activity, the high school would have an auction sale every once in a while. One of the items I bid for was a doll made in Japan. It was a sort of a ceramic type of thing with dress and cap and so forth. And there was a girl whose father was in the bank at Huntsville, was bidding also. And I just ran her wild, outbidding her every time she opened her mouth. And finally she gave up, and I bought the doll. And I told the boy who was acting as auctioneer at that time, his name was Dynamite Phillips, or at least we call him Dynamite. I said, Dynamite, break that doll in pieces. It was made in Japan. So that's what he did. He just whacked it across his knee and broke it to pieces. And I'm sure that didn't make the girl very happy either, because she liked the doll. But I was not ministerially minded then like I became in years later, because I started my ministerial work with my first sermon December the 6th, 1942, just one day short of a year after Pearl Harbor. And that was in Bohannon Mountain Schoolhouse in South Madison County. Not much activity then, but it did result in my being licensed to preach by the First Baptist Church of Huntsville. The draft was instituted, I think, even before Pearl Harbor, and a person became draftable at age 18 at that time. There were some who volunteered rather than being drafted. The Army serial numbers, which now is replaced by Social Security numbers, but the Army serial numbers had a designation where you could look at a man's serial number and tell whether he was drafted or whether he volunteered. If the number started with a 3, he was drafted. If it started with a 1, he was a volunteer. My number was 18141-142. And there were those who tried to evade the draft, as has happened, I guess, in every war the U.S. has been involved in. There were others who went to the draft board because they were not taking volunteers part of the time. They went to the draft board and volunteered to be drafted. And I think that was the case of one of my older brothers. Various schemes were used to evade the draft. I have talked to men in recent years. One of them put a quid of tobacco under his arm to elevate his temperature. And in doing that, he failed the physical part of the examination and knew he would. And he lived to regret it. I was talking to him 35 or 40 years after the incident, and he still was sorry that he had done it that way. In our family, there were 4 of us who were in military service. The older one had a 3 in front of his number, indicating that he was drafted, but it was a volunteer drafting, as I understand it. Later, when he became a commissioned officer, that 3 was dropped and an O was placed in front of it. The second fellow, the one 2.5 years older than I think volunteered for the Navy, and he served in the Navy, the oldest one in the Army. The oldest one had not wanted to go into military service for combat, and he asked for non-combat duty as a medical corpsman. And in that role, he received training at Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, Colorado, and was a medical corpsman throughout the war. He came back later, and as a surprise to me, he became involved in ROTC at the University at Fayetteville, went into active duty as an infantry officer. While serving in that, he became convicted for the call to ministerial work. By then he had married a Methodist girl and was active in the Methodist Church. We had been reared as Baptists. He resigned his Army commission from the infantry, went to Duke University and earned his credentials for ordination in the Methodist ministry, asked to go back into military to serve as a chaplain, and was commissioned the same commission that he came out, which is like an unheard of sort of thing. It's a wonder they didn't start him at the bottom rung of the ladder as a second lieutenant. The one in the Navy received training at Great Lakes Naval Station and at Millington Naval Base and at Jacksonville, Florida Naval Base, Millington being close to Memphis. He served in North Africa and in the South Pacific. Well, the defining moment came before that because of basic training where I was hoping to be a pilot. They were getting more pilots than they could shake a stick at. And they methodically washed out or eliminated 9 out of 12 in the group that I was in and made us ground crewmen. And to me, that was a severe disappointment. I wasn't getting what I wanted. I wasn't going where I wanted, and all of that. I was trained as a cryptographer, which is to code and decode messages before transmission over the radio. I went through Wichita Falls Air Base, Shepherd Field Air Base at Wichita Falls, Texas, designed to be 8 weeks. It lasted 13. And anybody that doesn't want to be in Texas has to stay 5 extra weeks, is sadly disappointed. I went to what they call a Crip School in Chanuteville, Illinois, then staging area at Smyrna Air Base near Nashville, Tennessee, and then shipment overseas going out from New York. At the staging area, they posted a list every day. Those whose names were on the list were designated to go either to Europe or to South Pacific. One fella who didn't want to go either was on sick call every day. His name was on the list until a sergeant placed, I guess, an MP with a sidearm. Do not let him go on sick call. And so he was shipped, I think, to the Pacific. I was shipped to the European theater, sailed on the New Amsterdam, a Dutch ship which had been on a cruise in the Pacific area when the war started. And at the time of Hitler's invasion of Normandy, the ship didn't have a base to go home to. It was chartered by some group I have not been able to identify yet, but the log of that ship has not been kept because it was not official logs while it was under charter. And I have not been able to locate it to determine what its cruise area was when I was on it. One day we could listen to a small AM radio station in the Azores. A day and a half or 2 days later, we were wearing overcoats for being close to Iceland. So it must have been a zigzag course. There was no ship in sight, no escort vessels. One day, when we were being awakened by explosive noises and by the alert signal on the ship, we were told to go to boat stations, which we had been oriented about before, in preparation for abandoning ship. We got out on deck about 5 o'clock in the morning at that location, and over the bitch boxes, the PA system on the ship, they told us of the D-Day invasion, so it was June the 6th, and I was halfway across the Atlantic. The D-Day invasion, as already known, was June the 6th. It was August the 20th on my mother's birthday when our unit actually entered on the beaches of northern France. We were on LSTs, or landing ship troops, and we heard airplanes overhead, and I don't know if it was rumor or fact, but we were told there were German airplanes flying overhead. I was asleep on the hood of a Jeep when some of the noise woke me up. The next morning we went on to the beach, not having to wade any, so it wasn't anything like the D-Day, because then they not only had to get off of the craft before they got to the sand, but they were being shot at from every direction. And we were not shot at, neither were we having to wade water. So it was an entirely different type of situation. We were in an apple orchard close to St. Lo, France. I don't remember of having tents. We didn't unpack our pup tents, but we may have slept in a tent that was there for passing troops. The story there was that the French were not so friendly as we might have expected. In fact, there was one series of episodes in which a sniper was shooting commissioned officers. It got to where the commissioned officers quit painting their rank insignia on their helmets because the sniper was looking for those helmets and shooting those men. They later found a 19-year-old girl who had been climbing the apple trees and waiting for a passing commissioned officer, and she shot him. And when they found her, then there was treatment to her as a prisoner of war, I presume. We went from the Cherbourg Peninsula to the west. Our place was at Morlaix, M-O-R-L-A-I-X, France, not far from Brest, B-R-E-S-T, the German U-boat base. I think Patton was leading that effort to go and capture that U-boat base. We got to the area where there was this, I believe there was a concrete runway, but in some of the bases where we were, I call them cow pasture airfields. They had a perforated metal sheet that locked into other sheets similar. And for just a limitless amount of extension, they could have had a runway for airplanes of any size or any speed. When we got to the air base, I asked one of the engineers who was there, how long has it been since there were Germans here? He said, we chased the last one off at 9 o'clock this morning. This was about 2:30 in the afternoon. We were an outfit that was mostly a mobile outfit in that we had about 20 men, about 12 vehicles, and only 2 of us knew how to drive. One of the commissioned officers had been a taxi driver in St. Louis, so he taught 10 of us how to drive. They took us out onto the airport in England and let us drive around until we learned how to manipulate the gears. And on the way back to the base, he stopped me and said, turn around. I said, but there's no turnoff place here. He said, turn around. That's an order. Ditches on both sides of the road, a narrow 2 lanes of blacktop. Fortunately, I didn't get in either ditch, so he gave me a license tag, a license card, which I still have among my souvenirs. So in France, at Morlaix, they were evacuating wounded soldiers in a hospital there on the base. If they could get back on the firing lines within 2 weeks, they stayed in France. If they had more serious injuries, such as scalp wounds, amputations, or whatever, they were sent to England for hospital care, and many of them eventually back to the U.S. and no more service in the military under combat. While there at Morlaix, I became very, very hungry for vegetables, farm products. I ate some fresh tomatoes to my regret. The French, I don't know if it's still so, but it was in '44, using household offals for fertilizer. And I was a victim of what in other areas is called Montezuma's revenge. I was in this hospital with the wounded men at the time that the U-boat base collapsed its resistance for the American forces. They were a determined lot. There was a cannon that kept firing at the American troops, and the men couldn't locate it, not having satellite pictures, of course, and not wanting to fly airplanes around over the place. They thought there may have been as many as a half a dozen cannons firing at them from different locations. They finally got some scouts up close enough to it at one time to find out it was only one cannon on a flat freight car, and they were shuttling back and forth across town, firing every 100 yards or 200 yards or whatever way they wanted to space their firing aims.
My name is John W. Foster, and most everybody calls me Jake. So I was in a 3rd Cavalry Machine Gun Company, 3M6, for the 6th Marine and 2nd Marine Division. I was in the service there from May the 12th, 1942 to May the 13th, 1946. And I was born in Blevins, Arkansas, and July the 29th, 1921. And went to school at Blevins and graduated at Blevins. And my dad had a grocery store there, and he's got and my mother was born there too. And I worked at Hope, Arkansas, right after I got out of high school at a department store. And when I was there, well, I met a lady across the street from where I worked, worked in the draft board, that drafted and tell when you're going to go in service. Well, she would let me know when I was going. So one Monday day, she says, they're going to call you Monday. And so that was Thursday. So I told Lex Key, a brother of mine, said, let's go to Little Rock and sign up for Marine Corps. Because neither one of us wanted to go in that Europe where the cold weather was. So we wanted to go where it's hot. And we passed all our examination and sworn in. Then the lieutenant asked us, says, when you boys want to leave? And, so, as usual, somebody in the back end said, the sooner the better. So I guess we left on the 12 o'clock train that night. In the basic training, I was assigned to a 155 millimeter coast defense. That would have been good to do. You sit on some little island with them big long guns and just waiting till they come to you. But I woke up the morning with what? Bumps in both jaws. Lex, the boy I was joined with, he got to go, and I never got to go in this 155 millimeter, but I never got to see him anymore. After 2 weeks in the sick bay, I was signed to a machine gun company, and we had to train in Champaign, California. But after, I'd say 4 or 5 weeks training, was put on a Dutch freighter. And we were on this Dutch freighter. It was crowded, and most of the men, a lot of the men had to sleep in lifeboats because there wasn't no place to live. It was just crowded and dirty. And another thing about it, that they had them in Java men had done all the cooking stuff like that, and he was sitting over peeling them potatoes and picking up had his feet in the pan and picking up the potatoes and peeling them, and I got to eat them. But that was better than nothing, all right. Says I was along the voyage we stopped at New Caledonia one night, and then our next stop would be New Zealand. There we went out every day and learned how to detail strip and learn how to fire a machine gun. Now this gun that we was firing was shooting 500 to 600 rounds a minute. And I didn't know during World War I, if you're a machine gunner, that your life was very short, because when you fired that machine gun, they're going to get you. And when you fired this machine gun, you had a number one gunner who fired the gun, and number two gunner, he would shove the ammunition into the barrel. And you had 4 men behind it. They would carry the ammunition and the water, because you had to have water in that gun because the barrel would get too hot. And if one of, say number one got shot, the number two man take over position. Every one of our men knew what to do to their own gun. If you got shot, you go up to the next position. You kept coming on up. When you got to the beach, the first thing you do, you got to find you some kind of cover. And what is funny about it, we'd on the beaches in Wellington, we took time out to try to dig us a foxhole or a gun emplacement, and it took us all day to do it. But when you land on the beach, it didn't take you about 5 minutes to find you some kind of hole or crawl in. You dug you another hole and crawl in, and it was, like I said, it was just full of mosquitoes, and there was coconut trees. One of them coconuts would fall out of them trees at night, and you swear somebody was jabbing behind you or something, or in front of you there. And it was just, after you pass those coconut trees, you run into nothing but jungle. And it rained every night. You never make what kind of clothes. You just had that one suit of dungarees on, and that's going to get wet that night. Every night you're just going to get wet. And smell, when you get in the jungle, you just had a machete, and you had to cut your way on a lot of it to get into it. But one day, right after I got on the island there, I was leaned up next to a palm tree, just resting, and a Jap put a bullet right between my fingers. Well, I come to find out, these trees, these Japs would have a Jap in them trees, and he'd have two rifles. He decided, had one landed his fire, and another landed to cut out the fire. He wouldn't even have to sight it because his gun's already sighted in. But when he shot it, as long as you found out, as long as you kept it moving, you had a better chance. And one night, a Jap bomber came over and dropped a few bombs. And this bomber was called Sewing Machine Charlie, because he sounded just like an old sewing machine pedaling. And just wasn't no motor car sound to it. It was just like a sewing machine. And on the radio, in these tanks and trucks, all your heavy equipment had these radios, and you could hear some girl talking, and she would say, things like this, would you like to be home now? Do you miss that girlfriend? They called her Tokyo Rose. And one night at about dusk dark, the Navy every time it's dusk dark, they'd take all the ships out in the ocean where the bombers come over, they couldn't hit all of them. They scatter them out where you wouldn't get to it. But they left all the LST boats, that's landing craft boats, and one destroyer. And in other words, they took a destroyer and put it at the foot of the cliff. Henderson Field had a runway, but it had a high cliff that goes out in the ocean, hang over to the ocean. And this bomber come over to bomb the field, and he dropped a few men, and he wanted to fix it to land. Now, this plane saw this destroyer at the end of the island, and he started to go get away from it. But the Navy, they only need one shot, and they downed that plane right there. The next day, the bombers came over again, and now they didn't see none of the big ships in the bay, because they were all out in off the runway. They came over and was going to drop more bombs, and a few planes to service and get them serviced. In other words, at this time, there was a cloud up in the sky, and up in that cloud, these planes were hid from these Japs. And he as this plane was trying to get away from these planes, he had just dropped all his bombs, and the bomb went down an American smokestack, one of the bombs did. And we picked up American soldiers 2 or 3 days there on the beach, you know, as they washed ashore. While the P-30s, in other words, while the P-38s and the Japs was all fighting up in the air, we could see the Japanese way over yonder. They just stopped fighting, wouldn't fire a bit. We didn't either. Just sat there and watched the air battle going on. And one night, there was a night, our lieutenant would tell us to take those pile of Japs and take the machine gun and go out there and spray them with the machine gun. Because during the middle of the night, they would be crawled up underneath them Japs, and they would throw the grenades and stuff on top of us. There was what it was. They had two guys in the was in the tank, drive the tank, 2 machine gunners, and 15 or 20 men in the bottom of the boat. Well, as we started in, the driver on the radio there told us, says, be sure and keep the front of your tank in front of and the wave at the back behind you. I was up there in front, one of the gunners up there. The other people couldn't see, but we could look up and look around, and you could see the wave behind us, and as high as a telephone pole coming at us. About that time, I looked up, and here come a Jap bomber fire, and somebody done shot it down. He'd like to ran right in front of us, but they didn't. But there was like I said, we had two drivers and 2 machine guns. Well, I looked over at my right, and the boy I went in service with, my buddy, Irvin Phillips, was in one of them other boats on the right-hand side there. And I seen him, the tank get sideways and start rolling and dumping the men out. Well, he told, when he went in, I just thought he's done got, I never thought he was something he lost. And our boat, though, it took us, I'd say anywhere from about 300 yards inland. This wave just carries us and shoves us right on in. Well, I don't know what happened. All the Japs was on the beach there between here and there, but there wasn't many there. And what was my job then? Well, after we landed, I had to place it was getting dark, and I had to place find a place a machine gun. When I was placing a machine gun, we just had half of the men all lost in that tidal wave, and during it, when there was the Japs started dropping, knee mortars or artillery or something they had, they would drop these shells on us, and when you drop the shells, one of them would be behind you, one of them in front of you. The next thing, you had to move that gun. If you didn't, it'd be right on top of you, because he was out there, he done had his sight on you. And during that middle night, he told us, well, when he got, let's see, well, he was, let's see, where was that? Oh, yeah, there was, while I was firing there, one of the boys, I had 3 guys there then in this hole. And while I was there, the Jap shot one of the boys in the leg. We tied him up and put a blanket on him and said, well, you're going to get to go to the States. Well, he couldn't get off because the second wave had never come in. And we couldn't go out. We couldn't get off because Larry couldn't get back. But he They found out later on he was about 2 holes behind us, and he bled to death out there, couldn't get off of it. Now I called Jeanette. We had called. We just cried, talked on that phone for about an hour. I spent about half of my paycheck on that one phone call.